Let's talk about what I mean when I say the words high concept. Oh my god, hey! Welcome back to my theatre-themed YouTube channel. If you are meeting me for the first time, hello! My name is Mickey Joe and I am obsessed with all things theatre. And this is my theatre-themed YouTube channel where I review the shows that I have been invited to go and see as a professional theatre critic working here in the UK. If you enjoyed today's video, then make sure to subscribe to my channel so you see more of the same coming very soon. Today I am particularly excited because there are few things I love more in the world than the works of Stephen Sondheim. And last week I got to go and see a particularly underrated Stephen Sondheim musical, Assassins. This revival is being staged for a brief time at Chichester Festival Theatre, and it is in so many ways a very bold and very different production of the show compared with how we've previously seen it. I'm going to tell you a little bit more about why today, and I'm going to tell you about director Polly Findley's concept for this revival and whether or not I thought it worked. So I hope you're ready. Here it is, my full review of Assassins at Chichester Festival Theatre. So let me tell you just a little bit about this show, because this is not a particularly well-known musical. Even among, like, the Sondheim musicals, which have never been the most commercial things in the world, Assassins is not a well-known show. The music and lyrics are written by Stephen Sondheim, the book is written by John Weidman. And it's an abstract narrative that brings together a group of presidential assassins, and would-be presidential assassins. It features the characters of John Wilkes Booth, and Lee Harvey Oswald, and Sarah Jane Moore, and Squeaky Fromm, and Samuel Bick, and Leon Czolgosz, and Charles Guiteau, and oh gosh, who was the other one? Who was the other one? John Hinckley. Did I say John Hinckley? Giuseppe Zangara. And even though these characters existed in different time periods throughout history, this show brings them together in order to create a dialogue about what motivates people to try and kill the President of the United States. We have a character called the Balladeer, traditionally played by one person, who sings various different ballads about some of the assassins, telling their stories, documenting their assassination attempts. We begin with John Wilkes Booth, which is the earliest of all of the assassins depicted in the show, and then we kind of move forwards through time, but it's a very non-linear structure. We broadly alternate between songs in which we find out about each presidential assassin and scenes in which they engage with each other and discuss their similarities and their differences and their motivations and their mania. But it's an evidently unusual show and a very controversial subject matter, which is why it's important, I think, that the show's perspective on presidential assassins is clearly articulated. More on that later. But the score has always been one of my favourite Sondheim scores. I think it's dark and brooding and insidious and very, very rich. You have these sort of musically ironic, upbeat ballads that tell the story of these murderous assassins, and then each of their songs which reflect the time period in which they lived. You have a little bit of ragtime, you have something a little older sounding, a little more classic for John Wilkes Booth, you then get like a country music into a disco moment as we move to a more recent decade. It's all very clever, which you would expect with Stephen Sondheim. The man was a genius. But I also give so much credit to John Weidman. I think this book ties this idea together so brilliantly. And honestly, I'm getting to the point where I'm a little bit bored of just linear storytelling. I would much rather see something more abstract, and especially during a time when we are drawing so much on historical characters in the post-Hamilton world, where we're telling all of these very worthy stories. I think it's interesting not just to look at one period of history, but to bring together different things with shared themes and a connection between them in order to articulate a bigger idea. This show manages to achieve far more and say far more about what could bring a person to this kind of an act by having all of those characters on stage rather than just telling the story of, for example, John Wilkes Booth. So that's a little bit of information about the material of the show, but what did I think of this specific production? So not to doom this one by comparison, but I first saw Assassins a few years ago at the Menier Chocolate Factory in a production directed by Jamie Lloyd, who at the time wasn't known too strongly for musicals from what I recall. It had an incredible cast, people like Simon Lipkin, Jamie Parker, Stuart Clark, Catherine Tate, Carly Borden. Oh, and Arrant of Eight, Tony Award winner Arrant of Eight. And that being an off-West End theatre in London, where the production was staged in Traverse, kind of like we're watching a very small tennis match, it was intimate and dark and and brooding and sinister, and it staged the whole thing at this sort of a ghostly abandoned fairground. Now, the opening of the show, as it's written, has the conceit of all of these characters arriving to a shooting gallery, being greeted by a character called the Proprietor. And what that does is very cleverly frames these presidential assassins as an everyman or everywoman, a regular person stepping up to try and win or achieve something that's been promised to them with a gun. There's a lot you can say about the futility of the American dream for the disenfranchised working class, all of that good stuff. Now, because this is such an abstract show, I think it benefits from that intimacy and not having too much of an additional layer put on top of it. I don't think this is a show that can withstand a whole lot of artifice. And Polly Findley's revival at Chichester Festival Theatre, I was intrigued from the beginning because this was happening in the main space and not in the smaller Minerva Theatre where I initially assumed that it would be. This was on the main stage of Chichester Festival Theatre, very big thrust auditorium. Assassins historically has never had as much success playing in bigger theatres because the material just doesn't really work, so I was intrigued and cautiously optimistic as to how this might go. What Polly Findley's production does is stages the whole thing within the context of an American political national conference, like the Democratic National Conference or the Republican National Conference. We have these big screens counting down, you have this sort of slightly immersive pre-show element with characters running around in mascot heads and getting the audience to do Mexican waves and singing along to things like Don't Stop Believing and clapping. Then when it begins, we get this sort of generic presidential candidate looking character. He's a little bit Reagan, he's a little bit Trump, and he entreats people from the audience to come onto the stage where they pick up a box with each assassin's name on and they then become that character for the rest of the show. When the curtains get pulled back, we see a recreation of the Oval Office, and this is the context in which the show is going to be performed. No hint of shooting gallery, no hint of carnival. There's the idea of bringing it into the modern day and kind of trying to reconcile these historical acts with the current turbulent political climate in the US, I guess. But the trouble with recontextualizing any piece of musical theatre is that if there's nothing really in the material to speak to that time period when you're moving it to, then it's only going to really be an aesthetic and atmospheric change. And as a result of that, viewing this through a contemporary lens, I don't know if it really adds that much. I don't know if we need that super modern setting around it to look at this from the modern perspective in which we already live. I think audiences are kind of predisposed to doing that anyway. So on balance, I think that this revival had some really great moments. There were some very strong ideas, but there were also some negative impacts and some unfortunate implications of staging it in this way. I'm going to tell you about both of those things. So what did I really enjoy about this production? I actually liked all of the pre-show element very much, all of the characters with mascot heads hyping everyone up, especially because you have to assume that a lot of people in that auditorium won't necessarily know the show. And knowing the show and knowing that it's about to take us to a very sinister and dark place was just mind-boggling and fascinating. And I think that contradiction was really, really satisfying when we then go into something and you see this idea of the American dream and patriotism just start to shred a little bit. And there's a through line from that right through to the song Another National Anthem that happens at the end of the show, and all of these assassins sing together about how the American dream has never really represented them and they're the ones that are left behind by this notion. That was also probably the best stage number in the show. It was pulsating, it was electric, it was dynamic. I think it's a brilliantly written song in any case, and probably the moment where we see the most value in having all of these characters on stage together. It's really the culmination of this idea, and the setting didn't interfere with that because we know that we're seeing them out of time because there's no other reason for all of these characters to be on the same stage. Some other parts that worked for me. So this is going to be a little bit of a spoiler. Towards the end of the show, we meet Lee Harvey Oswald. He is the only presidential assassin who was not introduced to us from the beginning. He, in recent versions of the show, but not originally, is played by the balladeer who has been singing everyone's stories. That character or that actor then becomes Lee Harvey Oswald at the end. In this version, the balladeer is shared between three performers, and one of them, Sam Thomas, became Lee Harvey Oswald at the end of the show. We see him in this extended scene with John Wilkes Booth where he tries to persuade Lee not to take his own life as he was originally planning to, but instead to assassinate JFK. As this incredibly tense scene unfolds, the other assassins get brought into it as well, and it culminates in this act of assassination that we are familiar with. And the way they stage this is that they part the curtains at the back of the Oval Office set, and he approaches them, and with this brilliant lighting, we then actually hear a shot. It's my favourite part in the whole score, when we just get this sudden, dramatic, slow, booming rendition of Hail to the Chief. And it's not so obvious as to be played in a minor key. It's still major and optimistic, but it just rings falsely because of what we've just seen happen. And this production does something particularly blistering. Now, it's not the first to feature the Zapruder footage of JFK being assassinated, but they show that footage on the giant screens either side of the stage as this moment is happening, which is a complete gut punch, as you would expect. It's kind of horrifying to watch that unfold, having just seen a scene in which we have watched the assassin be talked into this. Seeing the characters celebrating on stage and jumping up and down as we continue to watch this unimaginable footage. I don't know if the shock value of that kind of interrupts and steps on what's happening on stage, because it is quite a lot. Another really fantastic moment is featured in the Ballad of Charles Guiteau. He's a very eccentric character who, if I remember correctly, assassinated President Garfield because he wanted to be made ambassador to France and he was trying to promote the sales of his book. And we see him singing this song in which he acknowledges that he is about to be put to death by hanging. And as he is going up the steps singing this kind of happy-go-lucky ragtime song, look on the bright side, look on the bright side, the steps are lighting up as he is walking up them. It's some tremendous lighting, and it shows a brilliant understanding of the layer of dark humour that exists within this show, where you have this falsely positive and optimistic song of a character who is about to be hanged for assassinating the president. But to show him literally dancing up the steps towards his noose and them lighting up with light bulbs in this showbiz style is completely brilliant. It's not shying away from the darkness of it all. It's very much in keeping with the twisted wit with which the show has been written. Shout out to Lizzy Connolly and Richard Howell, who are the set designer and the lighting designer, respectively. There's one moment I genuinely don't know how I feel about, because the song Unworthy of Your Love is usually played as a very sincere moment in this show. And it's a duet between two of the assassins, both of whom were motivated by their affections for somebody else. We have John Hinckley, who was trying to kill the president in order to gain the attention of actress Jodie Foster, and we have Lynette Squeaky Fromm, who was doing it because of her relationship with the serial killer Charles Manson. When the two of them meet in the musical Assassins, they become competitive and argumentative, and they then sing Unworthy of Your Love, where they both sort of express the same idea. Again, it's usually played as this very sentimental and touching moment where we get to glimpse the sincerity of what they think that they feel and what they actually believe and why this is such a big motivation for them. But in this version, it's done in a very tongue-in-cheek way where we get this big disco light effect and they are riffing and adding high notes because they are competing with each other as to who can make more of a display of their love. And what we lack in that moment is a little bit of the sincerity. That being said, it got a huge reaction from the audience. And other people I spoke with said that was one of their favourite moments of the show. It got a big laugh. This is not a show that is rife with comedic moments, certainly not like laugh out loud entertaining comedic moments. So there's value in that as well. And I can appreciate a big swing. I think it was funny. I think it was a novel way of reinterpreting this number that's always been staged a little bit more traditionally. But I do also mourn for the depth of the character that you lose from each of those when they don't take their own emotions quite as seriously as I think they probably ought to. So those were a few of the things I really loved about the show. Let's move on now to what I didn't like as much. So while there were some really genius moments of staging and some just pockets of fantastic things within this version of the show, I don't know if the overall approach was really rewarding enough to make up for the big problems that it carried with it. First of all, the show really doesn't work on this big a stage. It's an intimate piece, and when played in this big auditorium, it feels awkward and the pacing was a little bit off. You felt like this was an audience that wanted to clap and wanted to laugh, and that was not what this show was necessarily going to provide consistently in the way that some others might. I think because it's unusual and because these characters are all such morally questionable individuals, I don't know if that plays well to a whole auditorium of people. I don't know if staging different assassinations plays well to a whole auditorium of people. The score is not conducive to that. The script is not conducive to that. It plays much better in a more intimate setting. And if there is a way of staging assassins on a larger set this was not it. We noticed the problems the most in that late scene between Lee Harvey Oswald and John Wilkes Booth. Booth is upstage of Lee, who keeps trying to flee him and retreat through this central aisle into the audience. As the two of them debate with each other, they're both walking in these strange paths around the stage. It reminded me of those vacuum cleaning robots that just sort of absent-mindedly find routes around your lounge as they're hoovering things. But there didn't seem to be an awful lot of purpose to their movements. And at the end of the scene, when he's trying to push him towards this act, all of the staging is pushing Lee further and further into the audience, when what we really ought to be doing is pushing him towards the window where that act is going to take place. Because when he ultimately decides to, he's as far away from the window as he can be, and he has to sort of gingerly then just walk through them and go and do it. And rather than slowly and painstakingly making his way towards it and grappling with the enormity of what he's about to do, he comes to a decision and then just sort of ambles over there and shoots the president. Like, it's not theatrically rewarding. The script provides this tremendous building of tension. The acting was giving us a tremendous building of tension. The staging did not work with that. The other really big problem in this show is this whole layer of artifice and the whole high concept idea of restaging it at this political national convention. You had the three balladeers all sharing the role, all dressed as different broadcasters, presumably representing different networks and sort of taking on the roles and appearances of some familiar American broadcaster stereotypes. Again, there's nothing in the script for them to align with these new characterizations. The balladeer really is just a person who sings about assassins who really has no forthcoming personality. I think there's merit in framing it this way, but what we lose from that is the individuality of this one balladeer character who will later go on to play Lee Harvey Oswald. Again, one of them did, but separating them out and having them do that doesn't really make an awful lot of sense. There's a clever through line in this show from a moment right at the beginning where John Wilkes Booth implores the balladeer to finish telling his story and help him articulate the reasons behind his assassination of Lincoln, with then the scene between John Wilkes Booth and Lee Harvey Oswald at the end where he's coercing him into shooting JFK. And you lose that when you split the balladeer into three people. Ultimately, the biggest problem with doing this is it's confusing. This is already an abstract show. If we add another layer on top of that with this setting where they aren't really, where the proprietor looks like the president and some scenes are staged literally and others are abstract, it can be very confusing. And the problem amongst all of that is that you lose the intention of the show. In this version of Assassins, it simply isn't clear what the material is trying to articulate, and that's very dangerous in a show with polarizing themes, because it will start to look, unfortunately, like the material and like the show might be trying to glorify and deify these characters, especially towards the end of the show, where it's giving them so much space on stage to represent themselves and to talk about their desires and their motivations. If we lose sight of the central themes of this show and the ideas of how an ordinary person can be brought to this kind of an act and how they are disenfranchised by a broken system, then the whole thing can start to look a little bit misguided. I also want to talk about costumes. So after the assassination of JFK, right towards the end of the show, there is a song that has been added since the original version in order to reflect the mood of the American public when an assassination happens. You have various different characters from different time periods who sing together on a song, Something Just Broke, which details how they reacted when they heard the news of the president's death. Now, in this version, they are all costumed in very patriotic, very on-the-nose, stars and stripes, red, white and blue outfits, and I don't know if that's particularly effective. Not only do we lose the idea of them representing different citizens from different time periods who lived under different presidents, but also it frames them as enormous patriots, which is not what this song is about. These are meant to represent as much ordinary American citizens as the assassins were. They are the other side of that same coin. While a normal person can rise up and take a gun and try and kill the president, these are the other normal people who just react to this. Some of them are devastated, some of them are more nonplussed. The lyrics of this song aren't articulating this enormous outpouring of grief for a beloved president. They are just talking about this profound and uncertain reaction that happens when something destabilizes the nation like that. So Stars and Stripes were a no from me. I don't think they work for that moment. I think I've said enough about some of the choices made in this production. Let me tell you about the performances. So this is a bigger cast than this show would normally have. I'm going to do my best to tell you about as many performers as possible. Danny Mac, as featured on the programme, plays John Wilkes Booth. I think he does a wonderful job. What I look for in this character is passion, and he gives us passion more so at the end than he does in the beginning. He's suave but also short-tempered, he's manipulative, he has this air of authority about him. He gives a wonderful vocal performance in The Ballad of Booth at the beginning of the show. He does have a line towards the end of that song that includes a racial slur, and in this one they choose to simply bleep out that entire section, and the balladeers who are playing broadcasters sort of shamefully turn their backs on him when that happens, which is an interesting way of staging that in the modern day with an awareness of sort of the gravity of that. Certainly that line was never written in order to sort of like uplift and encourage his ideas and in support of his racism. I think it's meant to just reflect who he is as a character and allow the audience to make that decision for themselves, but this one doesn't really give us that much space. Of the balladeers, they each bring different qualities. I think Lizzy Connolly's is the most effectively characterised. She's the only one who really has a discernible personality as her newscaster. Sam Thomas goes on to play Lee Harvey Oswald at the end. I thought he did a fantastic job with that characterisation. And Liam Tamne is probably in the finest voice of the three when singing the balladeer material, and he gets some of the best melodies for that as well. Luke Brady played Giuseppe Zangara. This is one of my favourite acting performances I think I've seen Luke Brady give. I saw him first years ago on this same stage playing Anthony in Sweeney Todd. I saw him not too long ago in The Prince of Egypt, and I thought he had a really well-crafted characterisation in this one as Zangara. Amy Booth Steele played Sarah Jane Moore. Amy Booth Steele has the ability to make you laugh hysterically in silence with physical comedy for such a long time. She is hilarious and odd and quite wonderful. Carly Mercedes Dyer, always a joy to watch on stage. She brings nothing if not energy and commitment to a role opposite Jack Shalhoub, who was playing John Hinckley. He was brooding and insular and irritable, and I thought he was fantastic and really shone in the performance of Unworthy of Your Love. Sam Oladeinde played Leon Czolgosz, and I thought his was a really valuable characterization as well. Probably the one where we most understood this idea of the assassin as someone coming from being an American everyman. He has this exchange with Charlotte Giaconelli, who is playing Emma Goldman, the same Emma Goldman who appears in the musical Ragtime, and that was a very revealing one, and that allowed him to show vulnerability and passion and affection in a way that beautifully contrasted with his character becoming a presidential assassin. Nick Holder played Samuel Bick. Samuel Bick gets these two extended monologues on stage, and they are darkly comic. He gets to banter with the audience, he gets to scream at the audience, he gets some great comedy moments. And the tone of these is fantastic, and some people really enjoyed them. Like I said, this is an audience that was looking for a reason to laugh. I think I just wanted them to have a little bit more gravity, or a little bit more of a contrast between the two. From the first monologue to the second, maybe we feel a little bit more despair. Maybe he starts to feel a little bit more unhinged. Maybe he leaves himself somewhere to go in the first one so that his performance can climb and escalate to that slightly higher level. But I have saved my absolute favourite for last. A star performance from Harry Hepple, the wonderful Harry Hepple, who is playing Charles Guiteau. He is funny and charismatic and bizarre and completely unhinged. He shows tremendous showmanship in The Ballad of Charles Guiteau, and I think it's just a fantastic performance. Probably the great performance in this show. So who would I recommend Assassins to? If you already know this show and you already like this show, I think this is absolutely worth seeing because it's such a different version. And that's something that Stephen Sondheim fans are used to. So many Sondheim musicals have had radical reinterpretations and different recontextualizations over the years. So I think this is absolutely worth seeing just so you can be part of the conversation. If you like your musicals a little bit more traditional, then probably any production of Assassins is not really going to be for you. If you're looking for something more happy clappy, or even just something more structured. This is a challenging watch on an emotional level. It's a challenging watch on a mental level because, like I said, it's a complex and abstract show. But if that does sound like something that you are interested in, if you want to see something that evokes these themes within Americana over the last couple centuries and has difficult and blistering conversations about all of these presidential assassins as layered human beings, then you should absolutely go and see this at Chichester Festival Theatre. I would advise you to actually listen to the cast recording beforehand because I think Sondheim lyrics are just brilliant and need to be appreciated. I wouldn't want to go and see this show with a risk of not catching every single word. There is so much meaning in every single line of this score, and there are moments in this version where I thought if I didn't already know them, then I might not have caught them. There is more content advisory information available on Chichester Festival Theatre's website, but I will add that of course there are gunshots throughout the performance, which I didn't think were particularly startling. If you're someone who just can't cope with gunshots whatsoever, this is not going to be the show for you, but they begin quite early on and happen consistently. They are a sound effect and not a live gun being fired on stage, so you get used to them, and I didn't notice many people. It's not the kind of a gunshot that makes you jump. I didn't notice that happening a lot in the show. But those have been my thoughts about Assassins at Chichester Festival Theatre. And I'm wondering if this might not be the last that I've seen of this production. This is a big set, this is a big cast, it's a big swing for this venue who usually program something a little bit more traditional on their main stage. It's only having a brief run in Chichester. I'm wondering if there is a West End journey planned for this show. We will just have to wait and see. In the meantime, thank you so much for watching today's review video. I hope that you have enjoyed. If you did, make sure to subscribe to my theatre-themed YouTube channel for many more reviews coming very soon. I hope that everyone is staying safe and that you have a stagey day. For 10 more seconds, I'm Mickey Joe Theatre. Oh my god, hey. Thanks for watching, have a stagey day. Subscribe!